Okay, so we're continuing the look at the 1876 Philadelphia World Exposition. And we talked a little bit about yesterday some of the reasoning behind this decision to go ahead and do this, the celebration of the centennial and how everything was going to be paid for and everything else. There's also a fair amount of opposition to the idea of hosting this. And the opposition kind of falls into a couple of different categories for reasons. Number one, let's just talk about money. The expo was going to cost millions of dollars in back then money, which would be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions in today money. And the country was dealing with economic crises. We talked a little bit in class about Grant's complete financial ineptitude and his poor handling of the issue of the gold scheme by his friends Fisk and Gould. In 1873, the U.S. economy went into the tank because of over-speculation and poor lending policies on the part of U.S. banks. And quite frankly, some government expenses regarding railroads that really were quite suspect. The economy was horrible. And a question that many people had was, what is the point of spending millions of dollars on a party and on like a big to-do, an event, a social thing that may not even achieve what we're hoping that it does? Which leads kind of the second point of opposition. It's Philadelphia. This is not London or Paris or Vienna or any major European city. It's Philadelphia. Yeah, it's a couple of hundred years old, but it's not, it doesn't have the pedigree or the background of some of these European cities. And aside from that, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Philadelphia during the summer, but it's blazingly hot and muggy, kind of nasty. And remember, in 1876, there's no air conditioning. So there's a legitimate question there of, are people even going to bother to show up to this thing? Which leads to the next one of, America is just going to embarrass itself. People aren't going to want to show up, and those who do are going to be, looking around and like, oh, like America, look at all these quaint things that they, that they have, but it's just kind of blah. It's nothing compared to what, we in Europe can offer or anything else. There was a genuine fear that America would simply be humiliated. Nevertheless, after the acceptance over the course of a decade, America planned this out and invested a lot into it. And when all was said and done, 37 countries decided to attend and set up displays, and people came from all over the world to Philadelphia. And this is actually despite the fact that the U.S. had slapped really high tariffs on European products. Now, don't forget that a tariff, let me see if I got a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And the U.S. had some pretty high tariffs going at the time. Even still, despite that, countries still showed up. Now, it is, however, fair to say that not everything was as good as it maybe could have been or that America was hoping for. 25 of the 37 states attended and had displays. So I don't think this is really that big of an issue to figure out. The states that didn't show up were the southern states. They simply could not afford to go. The states had to pay for their own displays. The southern states had no money. They couldn't do it. And it's not like they didn't want to show up. They just literally couldn't. Now, in the concern that people had that America would embarrass itself because what do we have to offer, might not be a bad idea here to look at a comment from the Times of London, which was like the major news source for England. The London Times correspondent said, quote, "The American invents as the Greek sculpted and the Italian painted. It is genius." So what exactly does that mean? What it means is that America, somehow or another, could show off and sort of like highlight inventions and industrial products that were beyond the scope and imagination of anybody else. Now, the 10 years prep time for this really paid off in some respects. So this is a picture eventually that will show up. This is the Hall of Industry in Philadelphia for the World's Fair. It's pretty big, okay? This was, at the time it was built, the largest building in the world. It was massive. And inside of it were inventions and machines from every major country in the world. But the thing that got everybody's attention was the amazing ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit of the American inventor and American industrialist. The most significant invention on display was this. This is the original telephone. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. You talked in this side, noise came out of the other end. The opening ceremony was conducted by President Ulysses S. Grant and his wife and their special guests, their Imperial Majesties, Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil, where the nuts come from, and his wife. Now, you might not have realized that Brazil was an empire. It was. At the time we're talking about, Brazil was actually the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere, which is kind of weird, especially given our modern sensibilities. But anyways, His Majesty Don Pedro, was like, "Oh, what is this strange item?" And he started talking, and the machine said, "Hello, Your Majesty." Don Pedro began running around like an excited schoolgirl, screaming, "It talks! It talks! It talks!" It was sheer genius on display, and really set the tone for what America was going to have and show off at the expo. Now, steam engines and steam power had been around for well over a century by this point. And in fact, the earliest, steam engine prototypes had, like, you go all the way back to ancient Greece. But what was amazing was America's steam engine this is the world's largest steam engine for the fair. This is the inside of the fairground area. This gigantic machine produced the power that allowed all of the displays inside the fairgrounds to actually functionally work. And it's obviously huge, and the scale of it is enormous. The internal combustion engine. So this is an idea that had been around for a really long time. But the Americans produced the first practically functioning internal combustion engine. It was designed, I believe, by a German immigrant, but it was an American product. Two of the people who were at the fair were a couple of German engineers named Daimler and Benz, who used this idea and went back to Germany, and a few years later debuted the first internally combustion-powered automobile, the Mercedes-Benz, named after Mr. Benz's daughter, Mercedes. An internal combustion engine works by you use a liquid fuel source that produces small explosions that move the pistons and cylinders up and down, moving the gears, instead of having to rely on coal or wood, you have a liquid fuel source which does this. The early internal combustion engines not very efficient or effective, but they were sort of dialed in. And in fact, the first Mercedes-Benz were designed to run on vegetable oil, which is kind of super cool and would smell amazing if you think about it. The typewriter. Now, this thing looks like some kind of medieval torture device, and it's certainly not the kind of keyboard that we're used to. So for those of you who don't know what a typewriter is, a typewriter is like a computer keyboard, but instead of like having a screen that you like type, things come out on, these little keys, as you push them down, send a small stamp with ink onto a piece of paper. The paper went inside this funky looking thing right here, and as you typed, the thing would move itself over and you would push it back and go on to the next line. This really made it very practical for business communication and involving anything that needed written forms of records or communication, because you no longer had to deal with the problem of illegible handwriting or something being misunderstood or misinterpreted. The monorail, or as my kids used to call it, the up-choo-choo. The monorail was a large engine, steam train, that ran on a single track. Generally, it's elevated above the ground. You will notice here there is a small steam engine in the back built here onto this. It's like a moving house almost. These are really common at Disney World, and they have them at some of the bigger airports around the country. This is the first time the monorail was ever used. And the monorail in this case was, you see the bottom part here, this was the area between the Hall of Agriculture and the Hall of Horticulture, where you would move from food products grown to wild plants and flowers and things like that. And as you went through, the monorail took you over like a park area that you could look out and see what was going on underneath you. The electric dynamo, the original light bulb, it did not work at all well. But the idea that you could send an electrical current into a glass and produce light without any type of like natural gas or a fuel source was really kind of cool. One of the people who was at the fair who saw this idea was Thomas Edison, who went back and stole it and 3 years later debuted the incandescent light bulb. The steam-powered elevator from the Otis Elevator Corporation. So the elevators had been around for a really long time. And early elevators were either powered by an animal. So either you would have either you would have an animal or something pull, and there would be a pulley that would draw the elevator up or lower it, or you would use hydraulics where you would force liquid into cylinders that would push it up or down. The steam-powered elevator used a steam engine and a series of cables that would raise and lower things. And you could control where you were there was a mechanism, a selecting mechanism that regulated how the steam was used. The downside to this was there was no emergency brake on it, so if the cable snapped, you plunged to your death. But I digress. Well, the ice maker. So hopefully some of you may remember from the beginning of Frozen when young Kristoff and Sven were in Arendelle harvesting ice. They would, cut it out of a lake and pull it up and put it on a wagon. That's how ice was harvested back in the day. Like in Milwaukee, you would go on Lake Michigan when the ice got thick. You would cut big chunks of it out. You would pull it ashore, and you would store it underground in bales of hay to keep it cold and to keep it more or less solid, and that's where the ice came from. Now, there's a machine that you dump water in one end, and through a series of pipes and using some jiggery-pokery, it comes out as ice blocks on the other end. Big jump forward for preserving food and for providing a readily accessible form of coolness, especially during the summer. The air-powered rock drill and the air compressor from the Ingersoll Corporation. If you've ever seen those big machines breaking up the highway, those are air compressors. Essentially what it does is it sends a stream of forced air into a cylinder or a screw that either turns the screw mechanism, creating a drill effect, or the cylinder goes up and down, allowing a hammering effect. Big jump forward in the ability to mine, to quarry, and to demolish things. And certainly should not be overlooked, Elias Howe's sewing machine. Um, this worked, it was foot powered. You simply had a large pedal on the bottom. As you pedaled it, there was a belt that was pulled up here and drove this around, and there was a screw mechanism in here that would cause the needle in the bobbin to go up and down, making sewing so much easier. No pun intended. Okay, so that's looking at the inventions at the Hall of Industry. Now, there's other things obviously going on at the fair as well. And, you know, one thing I love about doing a state fair is, if we can swing it, is trying all sorts of different foodstuffs and everything else. This one was no different either in that respect. And what we'll do tomorrow is get a little bit more in depth about some of the other products and the foods that were available. Peace and love.